A trade everybody was expecting to happen and the end of an era. Zach Wilson's on his way to Denver. We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangreneNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, the Zach Wilson era is officially over for the New York Jets. The Jets trade Wilson, the former second overall pick, to the Denver Broncos. It is a late-round pick swap. We're going to break it all down today. We're going to talk about the trade. We're going to talk about Zach Wilson's unfortunate legacy in New York. We're going to talk about where the Jets go from here. Now, the deal did not bring the Jets back much in return, and that was widely expected. We all know the Zach Wilson era simply did not work out here. The Jets are actually sending a 7th-round pick along with Zach Wilson to Denver. It's pick 256, and in exchange, the Jets get pick 203 back. So essentially, it's Zach Wilson and a 7 for a 6. It's very Mecole Hardman-esque trade return for the former second overall pick, and that speaks volumes about where Zach Wilson's value is right now. The Jets do get a little bit of cap relief. So like half of Zach Wilson's cap number was set in stone. Like there's nothing the Jets could do about it because that's just old signing bonus. The other half, about $5.5 million, was up for negotiation. And the two sides could negotiate how much do the Jets keep, how much does Denver take on. And at the end of the day, the two teams split that money down the middle. So the Jets will eat $2.75 million in salary for Wilson. The Broncos will take on $2.75 million in salary. So a little bit of cap relief for the New York Jets in this deal, which is kind of essential because the Jets are really tight up against the cap. The Jets are going to have to make some maneuverings between now and the start of the season. And the two contracts that seem the most logical are both at the defensive end position, Hassan Reddick and John Franklin Myers. Something's going to probably have to happen with one of those two contracts, but the Jets do get a little bit of cap relief, not a lot. And I think it speaks volumes about where Zach Wilson's standing is in the NFL right now, that the Jets actually had to eat half of the salary that could be negotiated in order to facilitate the deal, which does not really bring them back a whole lot. Now, if you're interested in like the some trivia with this deal, this is kind of interesting. The pick the Jets are sending with Zach Wilson, the pick number 256, was actually a compensatory draft pick the Jets received for letting Mike White leave in free agency and go to Miami a year ago. And White, of course, was Wilson's backup for 2 seasons, the first 2 seasons of his career. Both years, Wilson was on the bench when White played a great game. The first time it was in 2021 is because Wilson was injured. The second time, 2022, Wilson was actually benched in favor of White in November. And both seasons, White played a big game. One was against the Cincinnati Bengals in 2021. The other was against the Chicago Bears in 2022. So this pick the Jets traded with Wilson was the Mike White compensatory pick. So in a way, I think you can argue the Jets traded Zach Wilson and Mike White for pick 203. They packaged the two of these guys together, these two quarterbacks, and ended up getting a 6th-round pick in return. I think we all knew the Jets had to make this deal at this point. I think we all knew that the Zach Wilson era in New York was over. In part just because of what the Jets had said. I mean, the Jets had already told Zach Wilson they were trading him. There was clearly, at least to a degree, some office politics involved. The report came out after the season that Robert Saleh essentially wanted to pin all of the Jets' problems on Zach Wilson. Woody Johnson, never afraid to find a scapegoat to pin all the team's problems on, certainly did his own part in blaming Zach Wilson for everything after the season ended. But in reality, this was also the result of Zach Wilson just not being good enough. This was a really, really, really ugly situation. It really did not pan out at all for the New York Jets. There are busts and then there are busts. And Zach Wilson, I hate to say it, but I mean, he's one of the biggest draft busts of all time, especially with the second overall pick. This was a very damaging draft pick for the New York Jets. He, in 3 seasons, he never even finished higher than 30th in either quarterback passer rating or ESPN's QBR. I did a little research last night using the stathead.com database, and I looked up quarterbacks since the year 2000 with at least 33 starts, a completion percentage of 57% or lower, and 6.3 yards per attempt or lower. And these are really low stats. And there are only 4 quarterbacks who have done it: Joey Harrington, Blaine Gabbert, Kyle Bowler, and yes, Zach Wilson. So, we talk about a quarterback being a bust. There's a bust like Sam Darnold where, you see flashes here or there. I mean, there were moments during Darnold's 3 seasons with the Jets where, there were you saw him play and you said, if he can do that consistently, he has a chance to be a really good quarterback. With Zach Wilson, those were few and far between. Darnold was like a regular bust. Wilson was, well, I gave you the comparable statistically: Joey Harrington, Blaine Gabbert, Kyle Bowler, on that level of bust. And part of the problem with Zach was just there were so few moments where you saw flashes of brilliance. The second overall pick, and people talked about his upside, but you never really saw his upside all that much on the field. I mean, there were like there was maybe like a quarter here or there, or maybe like a half here or there. There in his rookie season, he played. It was really like kind of like a quarter and a half against Tennessee. It was like it began like the last minute of the third quarter. He played great in the fourth quarter. He played well in overtime. Like there was that moment. There was a game the late season against Tampa Bay where he wasn't spectacular. He at least looked like he knew what he was doing in the pocket. There were 2 quarters against Kansas City this season where he looked really good. The second and third quarter of the game against the Chiefs, the second half against the Texans. Or, you could go back to 2022. He led a comeback his first game of the season against the Pittsburgh Steelers, but that was really the fourth quarter of a game where he was very up and down. It's difficult for me to envision Zach Wilson putting together a successful career at this point. And that's one of the reasons I think it's difficult to object to trading him, because it's not like you've seen a lot of instances of him going out and looking great. And it's not like a case where the highs are high and the lows are low. It's not like you see him frequently succeed and you say, if he can just do that consistently, we've got something here. The problem with Zach is that the lows are really low. I mean, you think about some of the really awful games Zach has had through his career, many of them coming against the New England Patriots. That 4 interception game, the second game of his career in the home opener in 2021. The 3 interception game against New England a year later, the infamous game in Foxborough, the game at home against, I mean, I can just go through the New England games. But, like the lows are really low with Zach Wilson. That's the bottom line. The problem is that the highs really weren't that high. There weren't really a lot of moments where Zach Wilson grabbed this team and said, we're going. There weren't many instances where he elevated this team's level of play. And, 3 years into his career, I don't know that you're necessarily looking for a quarterback to be the difference maker every single week. But if a quarterback's ever going to become a difference maker during his career, you have to see more through the first 3 years of his career. So I'm somewhat conflicted, because I do think the Jets, I think the Jets as an organization tried to scapegoat Zach Wilson, especially for what happened last year when the franchise was broken from top to bottom a year ago. But it's really difficult to argue Zach Wilson looked promising during his Jets career. I mean, I actually think he was a little bit better in 2023 than he was his first 2 years. But again, that shows you how low the bar was, because he still could not get above 30 in either passer rating or QBR. His career stats are still his career stats. One of 4 quarterbacks since the year 2000 with at least 33 starts, 57% or lower completion percentage, and 6.3 yards per attempt or lower. Those are just not numbers that show promise. I mean, forget about numbers that'll get it done. Those just are not numbers that show promise. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our discussion of Zach Wilson. It's not all Zach Wilson's fault. I think that there are many areas where the Jets approach Zach Wilson in a flawed way, especially in this past year, and we'll discuss those as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I've used Game Time myself plenty of times right before the start of events. I've used it for tennis. I've used it for Broadway shows. I've used it for college football. Every single time I've needed a ticket last minute, I've just pulled out the app, a couple taps. I found an amazing deal, a great seat, and I've had the chance to check out the view from my seat before I bought. So I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. Again, Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, so you can buy Yankees or Mets tickets there. But we're also in playoff season when it comes to basketball and hockey. So want to go see the Knicks or the Rangers or the Islanders? Game Time's the place to go. Check out the Game Time app today. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. If you're a fan of Locked On Jets, you should know the Locked On NFL Mock Draft is available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who local Locked On experts like me are picking for every NFL franchise like the Jets, with live reactions from local college football experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL Mock Draft available now on Locked On NFL Draft, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about the end of the Zach Wilson era in New York. I actually thought it may take until the weekend for this deal to get done because the Jets were trying to get out of Wilson's contract. I think the Jets were trying to get another team to take on Wilson's salary, and they partway succeeded. The Broncos take on $2.75 million of Zach Wilson's salary for the year 2024. So the Jets get about $2.75 million in cap relief, which is sorely needed. And in this trade, the Jets send a 7th round pick, a late 7th round pick. In fact, the pick before the Mr. Irrelevant pick, which the Jets also own, goes with Zach Wilson to Denver. And in exchange, the Jets get a 6th round pick, 203. Not a very big return, but a small return had to be expected here, in part because if you look at what other teams have gotten across the league, I mean, this offseason, a number of Zach Wilson's classmates in the 2021 quarterback class have been traded. And these are quarterbacks who, frankly, have been more successful than Zach Wilson. Mac Jones went from New England to Jacksonville for a late round pick. Justin Fields went from Chicago to Pittsburgh for a 6th round pick that could become a 4th round pick based on certain conditions. And, Mac Jones had a more successful rookie season than any season Zach Wilson's had in the NFL. Justin Fields, look, the Bears moved on from him, but he's a more successful quarterback than Zach Wilson was. So you knew the price would not be big. The contract was also an issue. Other teams, including Denver, wanted the Jets to eat Zach Wilson's contract. The Jets wanted other teams to take Zach Wilson's contract on. So Jets and Broncos split the difference. It was a deal that had to be done. It just did not work out with the New York Jets. And Zach Wilson has to take a lot of the blame for that himself. And the Jets also, I think, have to take a lot of the blame here. I think if you look back to 2021, look, there were question marks about Zach Wilson. Anybody sitting there saying that Zach Wilson was an obvious pick at 2, I don't think they were looking at this with clear eyes, because Zach Wilson had a lot of flaws. And we talked about them in the lead up to the draft, what Zach Wilson's flaws were. And this was a risky pick. Now, it was a pick that was viewed as high risk, high reward. Obviously, it only ended up being high risk. Zach Wilson came in with a big arm. If you watched his BYU film, you saw some playmaking ability, but you also saw some question marks. You saw questions about his decision making. You saw questions about his accuracy, and those things really played themselves out in his time with the New York Jets, to the point where the Jets almost had to teach him to be conservative just because he couldn't make good decisions. He was too. If you leave him on his own to be aggressive, he's going to throw the ball into danger. That said, I think back to a year ago when the Jets made the trade for Aaron Rodgers. And look, the Jets were very quick to move on from Zach Wilson. It took about a year and a half for the Jets to bench Zach Wilson, which is unusual for a number 2 overall pick. Normally, the number 2 overall pick gets so much leeway that, it's almost like teams are willing to if they draft a quarterback number 2 overall, they're willing to let the quarterback just drag the team down. They're willing to let that quarterback destroy seasons. The Jets did not do that. Jets benched Zach Wilson after a year and a half. And in many ways, I felt like that was kind of the Jets giving up on Zach Wilson. But of course, a year ago, the team did make a deal to bring Aaron Rodgers to New York. And the Jets really played up the idea that they were going to fix Zach Wilson. The plan A was Zach Wilson was going to be their quarterback going forward. And that never really made much sense to me. First of all, the time frame just did not add up. Zach Wilson only had 2 years left on his contract, and the Jets kept talking up Rodgers like he was going to play 2 more years. And more to the point, the Jets kept talking as though Wilson needed 2 years on the bench. They needed time to sit back, to learn. The word reset was used an awful lot. But the Jets essentially moved forward as though Zach Wilson was not part of their plans. The Jets, if you thought Zach Wilson was salvageable and you thought he needed some time on the bench, what you should have done was gone out and gotten a veteran backup, or you should have gone out and gotten some other backup to step in. Because if your entire theory is that Zach Wilson needs time on the bench, well, you can't put him a snap away from being inserted into the lineup. Now, nobody was expecting Aaron Rodgers to get hurt on the first play of the season, but you had to know Aaron Rodgers getting hurt was a possibility. Aaron Rodgers, was 39 years old at the start of last season. He spent much of the previous season, 2022, playing through an injury. Yeah, I know he was playing through it. I guess he didn't really miss time for Green Bay in 2022, but he's an older guy. He's been banged up as recently as the year before you traded for him. You had to know there was a chance Zach Wilson was going to go into the lineup. And if the Jets were serious about salvaging Zach Wilson's career and turning it around, what they would have done is first of all, they would have gone out and gotten another backup. The second thing they would have done was just let him play every preseason snap Rodgers wasn't playing, because that would be the only game situation he would find himself in the year 2023. And he'd be playing guys who barely belonged in the NFL. And that plan actually, if you watch Zach Wilson in preseason 2023, you probably understand what I'm talking about, because what he did wasn't super impressive, but the narrative changes. It kind of changed the narrative heading into the 2023 season. And it's easy to forget this now. There was a lot of talk about Zach Wilson looking like a completely different quarterback, because he went out in the preseason, played limited snaps, and looked okay. He didn't look terrible, and people were going crazy about how different Zach Wilson is now. If you had let him play those full preseason games, if you had let him play against guys who really don't belong in the league, the third stringers, the fourth stringers, he would have torn them up. And then you really would have had a chance to build his confidence going forward. He would not have had to step into the lineup last year and take the beating he took. It just would have been a different situation, and maybe there would have been something to work on. Probably not. Look, I mean, quarterbacks who start their career the way Zach Wilson started his career, it usually does not work out for them. There were warning signs with Zach Wilson from the very beginning. But to put him in a situation, to claim that you're trying to fix him and put him into that situation he was in last year, and to make him one snap away, one potential injury away from stepping back into the starting lineup, and to have a lineup like that with the offensive line the Jets were putting in front of him, and Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb and those caliber receivers around him, and this is just and Nathaniel Hackett running the offense, and just sit around and look. Let's be honest, the Jets coaching staff quit last year. It's documented. We've seen reports on it. The Jets used the excuse, well, this offense is designed for Aaron Rodgers. They didn't try and change the offense. So, look, when you're dealing with a quarterback who isn't very good, let's be honest, Zach Wilson was not very good. When you're dealing with that kind of quarterback, that quarterback needs help, not an excuse-making coaching staff. And the Jets do deserve some grief. And what annoys me is that Zach Wilson was not very good last year, but the coaching staff essentially tried to pin everything on Zach Wilson. They tried to pin their own failures on Zach Wilson. And if Zach Wilson was ever going to be salvaged, like the coaching staff claimed they were trying to do, they would have not handled the situation the way they did. So I'm still annoyed with the coaching staff, and it's not so much. I'm not going to be one of those people that says the Jets failed Zach Wilson more than Zach Wilson failed the Jets. Look, at the end of the day, Zach Wilson just was not as good of a prospect as the Jets were hoping he'd be. But at the same time, the Jets coach Zach Wilson was a very convenient scapegoat for the people running the Jets. The Jets tried to camouflage a lot of the issues with the coaching staff and a lot of the personnel issues by just blaming everything on Zach Wilson. It was Zach Wilson's fault he struggled reading a defense. It was Zach Wilson's fault he struggled with accuracy. It was Zach Wilson's fault that he made poor decisions on the field. It's not Zach Wilson's fault the Jets had the offensive line that they had. It's not Zach Wilson's fault Nathaniel Hackett's here. It's not Zach Wilson's fault that Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb were here. That's the people running the Jets who made those decisions. And it was not all Zach Wilson's fault last year, no matter what Robert Saleh or Joe Douglas or the people running this team are trying to sell right now. And in many ways, Zach Wilson was a convenient guy for them to have, because Zach Wilson was able to kind of hide some of the issues that the people running the team created for the Jets in 2023. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn the page. Zach Wilson's era is over. What happens next at quarterback? I think we can expect the Jets to be somewhat active in the draft this year, and we'll discuss that in more detail as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let it out, especially to somebody who's unbiased in your life. So today I've been telling you how I really feel about Zach Wilson, and there's a good chance you're thinking the same thing. Zach Wilson was a very disappointing pick for the Jets. Frustrated it did not work out, frustrated about Zach's failures on the field, frustrated by the way the Jets handled everything. It just was really a disappointing tenure with the New York Jets. And you should know that therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team. So it's just sports. We all know Zach Wilson's failures don't actually affect you and me. Real life is real life. And it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible, inconvenient, and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. It's a great time for New York sports. Did you catch that Knicks game last night? Rangers coming up. Things not looking so great for the New York Islanders, but baseball is also in swing. Yankees off to a good start. Mets, kind of bouncing back after a slow start. The season didn't begin great for the Mets, but things are looking a little bit better of late. And FanDuel's the place to be. Again, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. Zach Wilson is now a former member of the New York Jets. So where did the Jets go from here? The Jets now only have two quarterbacks under contract, Aaron Rodgers and Tyrod Taylor. And all the buzz heading into the NFL draft, which is coming up this weekend, is that the New York Jets are going to focus on drafting a quarterback, but probably a late round prospect. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the Jets are probably not getting their heir apparent for Aaron Rodgers this weekend, because if you're drafting a late round guy, the odds of them hitting are pretty low. Yeah, there's the occasional Brock Purdy. There's even like the occasional Nick Foles, where the guy's a good backup who maybe wins you a big game or two. But it's unusual to find a quality quarterback on day 3 of the draft. Now, it's still worth it because those guys do exist. And even though the odds are low, when you find one of them, the value is so great that it's worth having. But I just don't think that the Jets are finding their heir apparent for Rodgers this week. If the Jets are serious about finding their heir apparent for Rodgers this weekend, they'll draft him in the first round or maybe like round 3, or maybe if they trade down and get a second round pick. But I think if the Jets were serious about finding the next quarterback, the guy who's going to take the snaps after Aaron Rodgers, they'd be drafting him early, because early is when most of the good quarterbacks go. I think that when you're drafting a guy day 3, it's a sign that you like his tools. It's a sign that there are aspects of his film, there are aspects of his game, there are attributes he's got that you like, but that doesn't mean you're banking on him. That doesn't mean that this is your guy going forward. This does not make him your quarterback of the future. It's more of a we'll see situation. We like what this guy brings to the table. There are certain things that we thought are intriguing. Obviously, there are flaws. Every single quarterback prospect who enters the draft has flaws, but there are also attributes we like, and we want to give our coaching staff a chance to work with this guy. Now, look, I'll be honest with you. I think part of the reason the Jets are not drafting their heir apparent this weekend is that, and especially when we're talking late rounds, is that they don't have a coaching staff to develop a quarterback. And I don't think that's the mindset the Jets have. I don't think it can be the mindset the Jets have. But I think if we're looking at this objectively, Nathaniel Hackett's not developing a quarterback here. It's very unlikely that Nathaniel Hackett's going to be able to successfully develop a project, especially a project quarterback. If you get a quarterback who's more of a finished product, who doesn't need a lot of coaching up, maybe that could happen. But those guys are all going early. So if the Jets aren't drafting a quarterback early this year, it's difficult to see how they're finding their guy of the future, because first of all, you need a lot of luck to draft a guy in the late rounds and have him pan out and have him eventually become a starting caliber quarterback. But those guys almost always need some work. There's some issue with their game. It could be a mechanical thing, it could be a physical thing. But Nathaniel Hackett's not going to teach that guy how to work around those issues. So I think it's unlikely the Jets will find their quarterback of the future. But, if they're not going to draft somebody in the first round or the second round, it is worth a shot. It is worth a look. And, there are some names that have been thrown out there. Michael Pratt of Tulane, who, I've watched some of him on film. And I mean, I'm not going to make it not going to act like I'm a Michael Pratt expert. I'm not going to act like I've watched every Michael Pratt Tulane game in depth, but not a guy who impressed me all that much from when I watched him. There seems to be a lot of buzz around him and the New York Jets. Jordan Travis out of Florida State, another one, guy coming off an injury, so maybe that's dropped his draft stock a little bit. But the Jets probably will draft a quarterback this week, and in part because it makes sense to have three quarterbacks on your roster now. Even if we get past the idea of having a developmental quarterback, and I think it's always a good practice to have dedicate one of your 53 roster spots to a developmental quarterback because the reward is so great. When you get to the back of your roster, you're not really dealing with guys who are very valuable. You're not really dealing with guys who bring much to the table. You're not really dealing with not every single player you have on your roster is likely to become a good player in the NFL. So why not use, even if it's a Hail Mary, why not use one of your roster spots just to try and develop a quarterback, try and hit on something with a young quarterback? That was Zach Wilson's role, or it should have been Zach Wilson's role last year. It could be the role of a quarterback this year. But also, tangibly speaking, it makes sense to have three quarterbacks on your roster now because of a rule change the NFL made last year, which essentially allows you a bonus active player on game day as long as he's an emergency quarterback. If he's the number 3 quarterback, he does not count against your allotment of either 47 or 48 active players on game day. You essentially get either a 48th or 49th active player. And maybe wondering what I'm talking about, 40 of your 53-man roster, 47 to 48 of them can dress for games. You have to have 5 to 6 inactives. And whether you get 47 or 48 active players depends on how many offensive linemen you activate. So it could be 47 for some teams. It could be 48 for others. Either way, there's a bonus roster spot that does not count against that allotment for an emergency quarterback, a guy who comes in if your top 2 quarterbacks get injured. So it's just like a bonus spot. You might as well take it, especially because the dangers of it's not like there's a tremendous high risk that both your starting quarterback and your backup quarterback are going to get hurt. But when it happens, it takes your team out of the game. And at least if you have a third quarterback, you're not running wildcat the whole game. Your third quarterback's probably not going to play at a super high level, but he'll play at a higher level than the alternative, which is essentially just going wildcat for the rest of the game. You can at least run a passing offense with a real quarterback in the lineup. So Jets, all signs pointing to the Jets replacing Zach Wilson on the roster with a day 3 quarterback. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll even use the pick they got from Denver for Zach Wilson to draft a quarterback. Wouldn't that be something? Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy this podcast and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you enjoy the show and are watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag show.